Welcome to Haunted Voice Channel. Before we get started, just a quick reminder, there are minimal ads in this video. If you enjoy the content, please hit the like button and subscribe. It really helps me create more stories for you. Also, I'd love to know where you're from and what time you're watching. I hope you enjoy the stories, and thank you so much for tuning in. Now, let's get started. I still regret agreeing to that camping trip. My best friend Jake and I had been planning it for months, a weekend away from the chaos of city life, deep in the remote woods of Blackthorn National Park. The place had always been rumored to be a hot spot for strange sightings, but we didn't put much stock in the stories. In hindsight, we probably should have listened. It started off normal enough. We parked the car at the edge of the woods and hiked about 5 miles in, far from the main trails, setting up our tent beside a shallow creek. The forest was thick and quiet, the kind of silence that presses in on you, making your ears strain for any sound. Even Jake, who was usually all jokes and bravado, seemed a bit subdued. The first night, as we sat around the fire, we heard a low, rustling sound from somewhere in the trees. I shrugged it off as an animal, but Jake's face had gone pale and he whispered, "Did you hear that?" I laughed, but my voice wavered. There was something about that sound, slow, deliberate, like footsteps that stopped as soon as you listened too hard. We passed it off as paranoia, but that night, sleep didn't come easily. The next morning, we met him, the park ranger. We were packing up to go explore the area when he appeared seemingly out of nowhere. He was tall with a wide-brimmed hat that cast a shadow over his face, and his uniform looked off, like it didn't quite fit him. His skin was almost gray, like he'd been sick for a long time, and his eyes, when he looked at us, were the darkest brown I'd ever seen. He didn't blink. "Everything okay, boys?" His voice was gravelly, and he lingered on the last word, stretching it out until it was almost a hiss. "We're fine," I replied, but Jake stepped back, clearly uneasy. The ranger kept staring, his eyes never leaving us. "You're not supposed to be this far out," he said, a crooked grin forming on his face. "This part of the park, it's not safe after dark." He didn't elaborate, just held our gaze for a moment longer than necessary, then turned and disappeared back into the trees without another word. I can't explain it, but something about him felt wrong, like he wasn't entirely human. As the day wore on, the sense of being watched only grew stronger. I kept seeing flashes of movement in the corner of my eye, shadows darting between the trees, shapes that vanished as soon as I turned to look. Every now and then I'd hear something, a low growl or the snap of a branch too loud to be just animals. I tried to brush it off, but I could tell Jake felt it too. By dusk, the forest felt suffocating, like the trees were pressing in closer, their branches clawing at the sky. We decided to head back to the tent, but as we neared the creek, we noticed something strange. The campsite was littered with footprints, odd ones, too large to be a person's, yet too human to be an animal. Some prints had toes, but others were just elongated, like stretched out hands. That night, the sounds grew worse. Around midnight, a low guttural howl echoed through the woods, sending a chill down my spine. I could hear Jake breathing heavily beside me, clutching his flashlight like a lifeline. And then we heard it, the voice. It was coming from outside the tent, a low, distorted whisper, repeating our names over and over. At first, I thought it was the ranger, but the voice was wrong, too shrill, like nails on a chalkboard. "Jake, Danny, come out and play." I held my breath, hoping it would stop, but it didn't. It was circling the tent now, the voice growing louder, more insistent. I felt paralyzed, unable to move, when suddenly the tent shook violently, as if something massive had slammed into it. We both scrambled to our feet, clutching the fabric, but whatever was out there kept circling, clawing at the sides. And then, just as suddenly as it started, the noise stopped. Silence fell, thick and oppressive, broken only by our ragged breathing. I whispered to Jake that we needed to make a run for it, but before we could move, we heard the footsteps again. This time they were slow, heavy, like someone was dragging something behind them. I peeked through a small gap in the tent and saw it, a figure standing in the clearing, silhouetted by the moonlight. It was tall, almost impossibly so, and covered in matted fur. Its eyes glowed a sickly yellow, and its face, I don't even know how to describe it. It looked almost human, but twisted, elongated, like someone had tried to stretch a person into the shape of an animal. Beside it, I saw the ranger, his face slack and empty, staring right at us with those dark, lifeless eyes. He held a hand out to the creature, almost like he was commanding it. Jake and I bolted. We didn't bother packing anything, just grabbed our flashlights and ran as fast as we could, crashing through the underbrush, branches tearing at our clothes and skin. I didn't dare look back, but I could hear them behind us crashing through the forest, getting closer. By the time we made it to the car, we were both a mess, bloodied and out of breath. I fumbled with the keys, and as I glanced back, I saw them standing at the edge of the tree line, watching us. The ranger raised a hand in a mock salute, and beside him that creature snarled, its eyes locked on me, filled with something that looked disturbingly like hunger. We drove for hours, not stopping until we were far, far away from those woods. When we finally reached a gas station, we tried to tell the attendant about what we'd seen, but he just shook his head. "You boys were lucky," he said, his voice low. "People go missing up there all the time. They say something in those woods, something that likes to play with its food." I never saw Jake again after that trip. He moved away, changed his number, cut all ties. Sometimes I wonder if he knew something I didn't, if he'd heard that voice calling to him in the night and decided he'd rather forget. As for me, I still dream about those woods, about the ranger's empty eyes and the creature lurking in the shadows. And sometimes in the dead of night, I hear that voice again, whispering my name, calling me back to play. Camping has always been our thing, me, Jake, Sarah, and Chris. We've been doing it for years, ever since college. No phones, no distractions, just the four of us and the wilderness. But this trip was different. We'd heard about a place deep in the mountains, far off the usual trails, a spot that barely anyone knew about. Jake had found it through some forum, a hidden gem for serious campers. The name of the place was Raven's Hollow. None of us had ever heard of it, but that's what made it so exciting. Something new, something untouched. It took us hours to drive there, the roads winding and narrow, cutting through dense forests that seemed to go on forever. By the time we reached the trailhead, the sun was already setting behind the mountains, casting long shadows through the trees. The air felt cooler up there still, like the forest was holding its breath. We grabbed our gear and set off, following a barely visible trail through the underbrush. There were no signs, no markers, just a path worn by a few brave souls who had come before us. As the light faded, the forest seemed to close in around us. The trees grew taller, their branches thicker, blocking out the sky. After a few hours of hiking, we finally reached the campsite. It was a small clearing surrounded by towering pines, a perfect circle of space that looked almost too perfect. Like something had cut it out of the forest. I shrugged off the feeling, figuring it was just the isolation getting to me. We set up our tents, built a fire, and settled in for the night. The usual banter filled the air, jokes, stories from the old days, plans for the next day's hike. But as the fire crackled and the night grew darker, something shifted. The woods around us were silent, too silent, and no crickets, no wind, no rustling of leaves, just nothing. We all felt it, but no one wanted to say anything. We just sat there staring into the fire, trying to ignore the oppressive quiet. Then, somewhere in the distance, a sound broke the silence. It was faint, barely audible over the crackling fire, a low, mournful wail that carried through the trees. "What the hell was that?" Sarah asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. "Probably an animal," Jake said, though his voice wavered. "A wolf or something." But we all knew it wasn't a wolf. There was something wrong with that sound, something unnatural. It didn't belong to any animal I'd ever heard before. The firelight flickered as the wind picked up, and the wail came again, closer this time. I exchanged a glance with Chris, who was sitting across the fire, his face pale in the dim light. "Maybe we should check it out," he said, standing up and grabbing a flashlight. "Are you serious?" Sarah asked. "What if it's dangerous?" Chris shrugged, but there was a nervous edge to it. "We're in the middle of nowhere. It's probably nothing. Could be a hiker lost out here." Against our better judgment, we all grabbed our lights and followed Chris into the trees. The forest felt different now, darker, thicker, like it was closing in on us with every step. The wail echoed through the trees again, so close it made my heart race. We moved slowly, our flashlights cutting through the thick darkness, but the beams felt weak, swallowed up by the night. Then suddenly we saw it. A figure stood just beyond the reach of our lights, motionless, tall, thin, and wrong. The proportions were off, limbs too long, head slightly tilted as it watched us from the shadows. "What the hell?" Jake muttered, stepping back. I could barely breathe. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. It looked human, but there was something about it, something twisted. "Hello?" Chris called out, his voice trembling. The figure didn't respond, it didn't move, it just stood there watching. "I don't think that's a person," Sarah whispered, her voice tight with fear. And then, without warning, the figure jerked forward, moving in a way that no human should move. Its body bent at unnatural angles, limbs snapping and twisting as it rushed toward us. We ran. I don't remember the sprint back to camp, I just remember the sheer panic, the feeling of something chasing us, breathing down our necks as we tore through the trees. We burst into the clearing, breathless, and collapsed by the fire. But when I looked around, I realized something was wrong. The fire. It was dying, flickering weakly, like it hadn't been tended to in hours. And our tents, they were gone. Completely gone. No trace of them, no gear, no bags. Nothing. "What the hell?" Jake gasped, spinning around in confusion. "We were just here," Sarah cried. "We didn't go that far." It didn't make sense. We'd only been gone for a few minutes, but it looked like we hadn't been here at all. Like the camp had been abandoned for days. And then, the wailing started again. But this time, it was all around us, surrounding us. I shone my flashlight into the trees, and there they were, figures, dozens of them, tall, thin, twisted. Their faces were hidden in shadow, but I could feel their eyes on us, feel the hunger in their gaze. We backed toward the center of the clearing, our lights flickering as the figures slowly closed in, their movements jerky, unnatural. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. And then I saw it, something that made my blood run cold. One of the figures stepped into the firelight, and I recognized it. It was Chris. Or at least, it looked like him. But his eyes were wrong, his face twisted into a grotesque smile that stretched too wide. He stepped closer, his body bending and snapping in ways that no human should be able to move. "Chris," I whispered, my voice barely audible. But it wasn't Chris, not anymore. The wail came again, louder, closer, and I knew. Whatever these things were, they weren't human, and whatever had taken Chris, it wanted the rest of us too. I don't know how we got out of there. I don't remember running. I don't remember finding the trail. All I remember is waking up in the car, Jake driving like a madman down the mountain road, Sarah sobbing quietly in the back seat. We never talked about what happened. We didn't tell anyone. How could we? Who would believe us? But sometimes late at night I hear it again, that low, mournful wail, and I know it's still out there, waiting. I never expected to be so rattled by a simple camping trip. I'd been out in the woods countless times, but that weekend, something felt different. I'd headed up to Old Pine Ridge, a place I'd visited dozens of times, a place I knew like the back of my hand. But that time, things just didn't feel right from the moment I arrived. I got to the trailhead around noon and immediately felt the silence pressing in. There was no bird song, no distant rustle of small creatures scurrying in the underbrush, just silence, It was unsettling, but I shook it off, thinking maybe it was just one of those days when nature was quiet. I hiked in, following a narrow, winding path that led to a small clearing where I planned to set up camp. As I walked, I caught glimpses of movement out of the corner of my eye, shadows darting between the trees, quick and soundless. I stopped a few times, looking around, but there was nothing there, just the trees, towering and still, and the quiet that seemed to grow heavier with every step. When I finally reached the clearing, I noticed something strange. There were footprints in the soft earth, big ones like a man's, but the strides were impossibly long. They led in a circle, stopping and starting at odd intervals. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I set up my tent and started a fire, hoping the warmth and light would chase away the unease gnawing at me. The shadows lengthened, and as night fell, the silence only deepened. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was out there, just beyond the edge of the firelight, watching me. Then, out of the darkness, I heard it, a voice low and soft calling my name. Tom. I froze, my heart pounding. The voice was familiar, but I couldn't quite place it. It sounded like my friend Jake, but that didn't make sense. Jake was hundreds of miles away, back in the city. I hadn't told anyone where I was going. I'd wanted a weekend to myself. Tom, the voice called again, closer this time. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it into the trees, but there was nothing there, just darkness. I was starting to feel foolish, so I sat back down, chalking it up to my imagination playing tricks on me. I was about to turn in for the night when I heard footsteps, slow and deliberate, approaching from the shadows. Tom, the voice repeated, and this time it was right behind me. I spun around, but again there was nothing, just empty space and the crackling of the fire. My skin prickled, and I knew I needed to leave. I packed up as quickly as I could, tossing my things into my backpack, dousing the fire with dirt. As I was about to shoulder my pack, a figure stepped into the clearing. I nearly dropped everything, but then I recognized the ranger's uniform. Relief washed over me. Oh, thank God, I said, forcing a laugh. You gave me a scare. I thought I was alone out here. The ranger just stood there, staring at me, his face shadowed. He didn't say anything, just kept watching me with a strange, unsettling intensity. Is everything okay? I asked, my voice wavering. He tilted his head like he was studying me and finally spoke. You need to leave. I was just about to, I replied, my heart hammering. I thought I heard something. A voice calling my name. The ranger nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving mine. It knows your name, he said. It knows all our names. My stomach twisted, a cold wave of fear washing over me. What do you mean? He took a step closer, his movements unnaturally fluid, almost too smooth. There are things in these woods that wear faces, but they're not human. They'll call you, make you think you're safe, but you're not. Not anymore. I backed away, my mind racing. This had to be a prank, some kind of sick joke. But the look in the ranger's eyes told me otherwise. His gaze was empty, hollow, like he was staring right through me. Without another word, he turned and walked back into the trees, his figure blending seamlessly with the shadows. I didn't waste any time. I grabbed my bag and sprinted back to the trail, not caring about the noise I was making, just desperate to get out of there. As I ran, I heard the voice again, closer than ever, calling my name over and over. Tom, Tom, come back. I pushed myself harder, the trees blurring past me, my lungs burning. I didn't stop until I saw the trailhead, my car waiting just where I'd left it. I jumped inside, locked the doors, and started the engine, glancing back at the woods as I pulled away. And that's when I saw him, the ranger, standing at the edge of the trees, watching me. But as I looked closer, I realized it wasn't just him. There were others too, shadowy figures lurking in the darkness, all with hollow eyes and twisted smiles, watching me leave. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away, the forest far behind me. But I knew that those woods would never really let me go. Sometimes when I'm alone at night, I can still hear that voice, soft and whispering, calling my name from somewhere just beyond the light. And I know that if I ever go back, they'll be waiting. It was supposed to be a routine check. Just another weekend in the deep woods, a few miles off the marked trails where campers like to disappear for some solitude. I'd been a park ranger here for almost 10 years, so I knew these woods like the back of my hand. But there was something about that night that just didn't sit right with me. The air was unusually still, as if the whole forest was holding its breath. No animal sounds, no wind through the trees, just silence, thick enough that it almost felt like it was pressing in on me. The sky was an odd, bruised color, even though it was past midnight. My flashlight was dimmer than usual, and I had the creeping feeling I was being watched. There was a campsite nearby that had been marked as problematic on the map. Last week, a group of campers had reported strange noises, but nothing came of it. I figured it was just coyotes or maybe a black bear, but protocol said I had to check it out. As I approached the site, I noticed the remains of a fire pit. Charred logs lay scattered as if they'd been kicked over in a hurry. The tents were still there, though, empty, flapping slightly in the faint breeze that had finally picked up. Something crunched beneath my boot, and I looked down to see a scattering of bones. Rabbit, maybe, or squirrel. But the bones were cracked and splintered in a way that suggested something had gnawed on them. I bent down to inspect them, and that's when I saw the footprints. They were large, misshapen, more like paw prints than anything human, but with elongated toes that ended in sharp, claw-like marks. I'd never seen anything like it. My radio crackled to life, making me jump. "Ranger Callahan, do you copy?" The voice was faint, distorted, but recognizable. It was Stephen, my partner, who was stationed on the other side of the park that night. "Copy, Stephen. You seeing this too?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. There was a pause. "Seeing what?" I was going to ask if you heard the howling. Howling. I hadn't heard anything. But as I straightened up, I did hear something, a soft, low growl that seemed to come from everywhere at once. I whipped my flashlight around, but the beam only caught shadows that stretched and twisted between the trees. It felt like they were moving, slithering toward me. "Stephen, you there?" I called into the radio, but there was nothing but static. I turned to head back toward the trail, but I froze in my tracks. Standing a few yards away was a figure, tall and gaunt, its outline barely visible in the dim light. It looked almost human, but the limbs were all wrong, too long, too thin, and the head was tilted at an unnatural angle. "Hey!" I shouted, more out of desperation than anything else. The figure didn't move, but I could feel its eyes on me. My flashlight flickered, and in that split second of darkness, the figure was suddenly closer. I felt a chill race up my spine. I took a step back, heart pounding, and tried to keep my distance as I circled around, keeping my flashlight trained on it. But the thing kept advancing, slow and methodical, until I could finally see its face, or rather, lack of one. There were no eyes, no mouth, just smooth, pale skin stretched taut over a skull. I tried to scream, but my throat was dry, frozen. Without thinking, I turned and ran, branches clawing at my face as I crashed through the underbrush. The thing was right behind me. I could hear its footsteps pounding in sync with my own heartbeat. I didn't know where I was going, only that I had to get away. I stumbled, falling hard against the roots of a massive tree. My radio clattered out of my hand, but before I could reach for it, I heard that voice again. Only this time, it was Stephen's voice. Except, different. "Callahan," it whispered, but it was raspy, broken, like someone was trying to speak through a mouthful of gravel. "Come back. You don't belong here." I scrambled back, gasping as I saw not one, but 3 of those things emerging from the shadows, each one more twisted and unnatural than the last. They moved in sync, their heads cocked at odd angles as if they were studying me, deciding what to do next. But then they stopped, sniffing the air, and I realized I wasn't their focus anymore. I heard a shrill scream echo through the woods, Stephen's voice, unmistakable this time, coming from somewhere far off in the trees. They snapped toward the sound, their heads jerking unnaturally, before they vanished into the darkness, leaving nothing but an unnatural silence in their wake. I didn't wait around to see if they'd come back. Somehow I managed to stumble my way back to the main trail, tripping and scraping my knees on rocks and branches, until I saw the faint glow of the ranger station. I burst inside, slamming the door behind me and locking it, my heart still racing. I radioed for backup, but when they arrived there was no sign of Stephen. We combed the woods for hours, calling his name, but there was nothing, not even a footprint. They finally called off the search, and Stephen was officially listed as missing. But I knew better. I never went back to that part of the forest again, but sometimes when the wind is just right, I can still hear that twisted version of his voice calling out from the depths of the woods. A chilling reminder that some things aren't meant to be found. And those who go looking, they don't come back. It was supposed to be a simple solo camping trip. I've done this kind of thing 100 times before, just me, my gear, and the woods. I'd found a secluded spot online, tucked deep into the heart of an old-growth forest. The site wasn't listed on any official maps, but some obscure forum posts said it was a prime location for experienced campers. Hard to reach, but worth it for the solitude. I liked the sound of that, so I packed up for the weekend and headed out early Friday morning. The first part of the hike was uneventful. Just hours of navigating trails that grew narrower and more overgrown as I went. By late afternoon, the underbrush had swallowed the path completely, and I was bushwhacking through dense trees. That's when I saw something strange. About a mile from where I planned to camp, there was an old, crumbling stone structure. It looked like the remains of a chimney, standing alone in the woods. No house, no foundation, just the stone rising out of the earth like a broken tooth. The chimney was covered in moss and vines, worn down by decades, maybe centuries. It gave me an eerie feeling, but I shrugged it off. Probably an old settler's cabin from a time long forgotten. I moved on, pushing deeper into the woods until I found a clearing. It was perfect, quiet, open, surrounded by tall, ancient trees. I set up my tent and started a fire, feeling the warmth of the flames push back the encroaching evening chill. The sky was a deep, velvety purple as the sun dipped below the horizon and the stars began to dot the sky. This is what I came for. Peace. Solitude. But that night, I started hearing things. It wasn't animals. I know what wildlife sounds like. Raccoons scurrying through leaves, owls calling, the occasional coyote howling in the distance. This was different. It started as a low murmuring, like a conversation just out of earshot. At first, I thought it might be the wind moving through the trees, but there wasn't any breeze. The air was still, heavy even. The murmuring grew louder, but I couldn't make out any distinct words. It was like several people were talking at once, just beyond the reach of my firelight. I turned on my flashlight and scanned the trees, but there was nothing. Just the impenetrable darkness of the forest beyond the glow of the fire. I tried to ignore it, told myself it was just the sounds of the woods messing with my head. But the voices, or whatever they were, didn't stop. They circled the camp, growing louder, more insistent. It felt like they were pressing in on me from all sides, though there was nothing to see. I crawled into my tent, zipped it up tight, and pulled my sleeping bag over my head, trying to drown out the noise. I must have drifted off at some point, because the next thing I knew, I woke up in the middle of the night to total silence. The murmuring had stopped. Relieved, I peeked out of my sleeping bag and glanced at the tent wall. But something was wrong. The light from the fire was gone. I should have been able to see the flickering orange glow through the thin nylon, but instead, it was pitch black. I unzipped the tent just enough to look outside. The fire had been completely smothered, as if someone had dumped a bucket of dirt over it. But the thing that sent a cold wave of fear through me wasn't the dead fire, it was the footprints. They were all around the camp, circling it like a pack of wolves. At first I thought they were human, but they weren't. They were too large, too misshapen. The prints were elongated, like human feet stretched and twisted into something unnatural. There were too many toes, too many claws. My heart hammered in my chest as I crouched there, staring at the imprints in the dirt. Something had been here, something not human. I closed the tent, locking myself inside like that thin layer of fabric would protect me from whatever was out there. The night passed slowly, every sound amplified by my fear. But nothing came. No more voices, no more footsteps. When dawn finally came, I packed up as fast as I could, eager to get out of that place. The feeling of being watched was suffocating, like eyes were on me from every shadowed corner of the woods. The entire hike back felt wrong, the silence too thick, the forest too still. It wasn't until I reached the main trailhead that I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. But here's the thing, when I got home I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me. I tried to convince myself it was just paranoia, but strange things started happening. I'd wake up in the middle of the night to hear that same murmuring, faint but unmistakable, coming from outside my window. One night, I found dirt and leaves scattered on my bedroom floor, like someone, or something, had walked straight through the walls. I checked my doors and windows. They were all locked. And then 2 nights ago, I woke up to the sound of footsteps just outside my bedroom door. Slow, deliberate, heavy. I stayed completely still, barely breathing, as I listened to the sound of something pacing in the hallway. I didn't dare open the door.
No.
In the morning, there were footprints in the hall, the same twisted, elongated prints I'd seen in the campsite. I don't know what I brought back from the woods, but it's here now, and it's not going away. Whatever was out there, it followed me home, and it's getting closer. I've always loved the woods. I became a park ranger because it felt like a calling, an escape from the noise of the city and a chance to immerse myself in nature. But after what happened last summer, I'm not sure I'll ever set foot in the woods again. I haven't told this story to anyone, not because I don't think they'll believe me, but because I don't want to relive it. But here goes. It was mid-July and the heat was suffocating. I was assigned to a remote part of the park, a section we rarely patrol because it's almost impossible to get to. Thick underbrush, uneven terrain, and a dense canopy that blocks out the sun even at noon. The park had been getting complaints about strange noises and shadows in the area, so they sent me in to check it out. I packed my gear, loaded up on water, and set out. The first few hours were uneventful. I'd been down that trail plenty of times before and knew it like the back of my hand. The birds were quiet that day, though, and even the wind felt still, as if the whole forest was holding its breath. As I moved deeper into the woods, I started noticing odd things. Tree trunks clawed deep like something with massive paws had taken a swipe at them, and tracks on the ground that didn't look like anything I'd seen before. They were too big to be from a wolf, and they had this weird shape, almost like a handprint with elongated fingers. My skin prickled, but I brushed it off. The woods are full of strange things, I told myself. I kept going. It wasn't until I reached the small clearing around dusk that I started feeling watched. The trees closed in tight around the clearing, their branches reaching like skeletal fingers against the darkening sky. I was about to radio in and let them know I hadn't found anything unusual when I heard it, a low growl, deep and guttural, coming from the trees. I swung my flashlight around, shining it into the forest, but there was nothing. I told myself it was probably just a bear, but my gut was screaming otherwise. I held my breath, listening, and then I heard it again, this time closer, accompanied by the sound of snapping twigs and heavy footsteps. Whatever was out there was big, bigger than any bear I'd ever seen. I decided to get out of there. I turned to leave, but as I stepped forward, the footsteps mirrored mine, crunching through the underbrush in perfect unison. I stopped, and the sound stopped. My heart was racing now and my pulse pounded in my ears. I took another step and again the footsteps echoed mine. I tried to shake it off, tried to tell myself it was just an echo, but I knew better. I was being followed. "Who's there?" I called, but my voice sounded weak, swallowed by the trees. There was no answer, just that oppressive silence. I picked up my pace, trying to stay calm, but the footsteps kept right behind me, never missing a beat. I broke into a run, and that's when I heard it. A voice, low and raspy, like someone trying to speak through a throat full of gravel. "Why are you running, Ranger?" I froze. The voice came from the shadows, from everywhere and nowhere all at once. It didn't sound human. I spun around, flashlight trembling in my grip, and then I saw it. Two glowing eyes staring at me from the darkness, too high up to belong to any animal. They were almost level with the tree branches, and they shone with an unnatural light, like fireflies in the dead of night. The creature stepped forward, and I wished it hadn't. It was massive, towering over me, with a hunched back and limbs that seemed too long for its body. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, and stretched tight over its bones. And that face. It looked almost human, but distorted, like someone had tried to carve a face out of melted wax. My legs felt like they were rooted to the ground. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. I don't know how long I stood there, staring into those eyes. But eventually, the creature turned and slinked back into the shadows. It didn't make a sound, and within seconds it was gone, but the sense of dread remained, heavy and suffocating. I finally managed to move, and I ran. I ran like I'd never run before, branches clawing at my face and arms, tripping over roots and rocks. I didn't stop until I was back at my truck, my lungs burning and my heart pounding so loud I thought it would burst. I reported the incident, but no one believed me. They laughed it off, said I'd probably seen a bear or maybe just had too much coffee. But I knew what I saw, and I knew it wasn't any animal known to man. A week later, a group of campers went missing in that exact spot. They never found any bodies, just bits of torn clothing and those same claw marks I'd seen before. They closed off the area after that, said it was due to unstable terrain or some nonsense like that. But I knew the truth. They were trying to keep people out, trying to keep whatever was lurking in those woods a secret. I still have nightmares about that night, about those eyes watching me from the shadows. Sometimes I think I hear that voice, calling my name, whispering from the darkness. I don't go into the woods anymore, but sometimes I wonder, is it still out there waiting for the next poor soul to wander into its territory? Or worse yet, what if it followed me back? The forest loomed around me like a fortress of towering black pines, their branches twisted into gnarled, skeletal fingers clawing at the dim sky. I was no stranger to these woods. As a park ranger, I had roamed them countless times. But this time, it felt different. I felt watched, and I could hear things. Small, shuffling footsteps that seemed to shadow me just beyond my sight. I'd been sent out to check on reports of an unauthorized campsite deep in the forest, far beyond the marked trails. It was already late afternoon when I arrived at the trailhead, and by the time I located the site, night had fallen, wrapping the forest in an impenetrable blackness that my flashlight barely pierced. The supposed campsite was nothing but a cold fire pit surrounded by a few scattered belongings: a ragged backpack, a single boot, and a shattered lantern. Then the sound started. At first, it was a soft rustling, like the wind brushing through leaves, only there was no wind. The air was deathly still, heavy with the scent of decaying pine needles and wet earth. I tried to shrug it off, telling myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer or a fox, but deep down I knew better. I'd been here too many times, heard too many strange stories passed around the ranger station about these woods. Tales of things lurking in the shadows, creatures that didn't belong in any textbook. And then I saw it, or rather I almost saw it. A flicker of movement at the edge of my vision, something tall and thin, like a shadow that didn't quite match the trees. My flashlight trembled in my hand as I swung it towards the movement, but there was nothing there, only the endless dark and the oppressive silence. The air grew colder, and I felt a chill run down my spine, an instinctive warning that whatever I was looking for wasn't something I wanted to find. I decided to turn back, but the trail was gone. I spun in a slow circle, trying to find the path I'd come from, but the trees seemed to have shifted, closing in around me like a living wall. I was lost. The realization struck me like a punch to the gut, and I fought to keep my breathing steady. I was no novice. I'd spent years navigating these woods, but now they felt alien, hostile, as if they wanted me gone. The footsteps returned, louder this time, and I could hear a low, guttural growl in the distance. It sounded almost like a dog, but wrong somehow, deeper, more resonant. I strained my ears, hoping to pinpoint its direction, but it seemed to come from all around me, echoing off the trees. Panic gripped me, and I started moving, stumbling over roots and rocks as I tried to put distance between myself and the sound. Then I smelled it, a sickly sweet odor that clung to the air, thick and nauseating. It was like rotting meat, mixed with something even worse, something that I couldn't quite place. I held my breath, fighting the urge to gag, and forced myself to keep moving, even as the ground seemed to shift beneath my feet, the forest playing tricks on my senses. A branch snapped behind me, loud and deliberate, and I broke into a run. My heart hammered in my chest as I weaved through the trees, the flashlight bouncing wildly in my grasp. Every step felt like it was pulling me deeper into a nightmare, the sounds growing louder, closer. I couldn't tell if I was being hunted or if I was running in circles, trapped in a labyrinth of my own making. Just when I thought I couldn't go any further, I burst into a small clearing, illuminated by the pale light of the moon. There, standing in the center, was a creature that defied logic, a twisted amalgamation of man and beast. It had the body of a man, but its limbs were elongated, too thin and too long, ending in clawed hands that seemed to twitch with a mind of their own. Its face was a nightmare, a grotesque parody of a human face stretched over a canine skull with eyes that glowed a sickly yellow. It opened its mouth, revealing rows of jagged teeth, and I heard it speak, a garbled mimicry of my own voice. "Why are you here?" it croaked, each word a guttural rasp that sent ice down my spine. I froze, paralyzed by terror, as it took a slow step towards me, its head cocked to one side like it was studying me, savoring my fear. I took a step back, then another, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from it. And that's when I saw it. My own face, stretched across its back like a macabre trophy, hollow eyes staring back at me in silent horror. I stumbled, nearly falling, and when I looked up again, it was gone, as if it had never been there. The forest was silent again, but now the silence felt alive, heavy with unseen eyes and the weight of things I couldn't understand. I don't remember much about how I found my way back to the trailhead, only that I ran until my legs gave out, and even then I crawled, desperate to escape the oppressive darkness. When I finally emerged from the trees, dawn was breaking, painting the world in a dull gray light. I turned back one last time, half expecting to see the creature watching me from the shadows. But the forest was empty, silent, as if it had swallowed all traces of the night's horrors. I left the ranger station that morning and never went back. But sometimes, in the dead of night, I swear I can still hear it, calling my name from the depths of the forest, waiting for me to return. Camping has always been a refuge for me, somewhere to escape the noise and chaos of the city. But after what happened last summer, I'm not sure I'll ever set foot in the woods again. I had planned a weekend trip with 3 friends, Sarah, Jake, and Luke. We'd found this remote campsite, miles away from the nearest town, nestled deep in the Appalachian Mountains. No cell service, no roads for miles. Just us, the wilderness, and the stars. The drive was long, but when we finally arrived, the view was breathtaking. Towering trees surrounded us, their thick branches almost blocking out the sky. The air was cool and fresh, with the scent of pine and damp earth. We set up camp beside a wide clearing, a perfect spot for a fire, with just enough open space for us to lie back and stargaze. The first night was uneventful. We shared some laughs around the fire, told the usual ghost stories, and eventually drifted off to sleep in our tents. It wasn't until the second night that things took a turn. It started with the wind. A sudden sharp gust swept through the clearing, almost strong enough to put out the fire. The trees groaned under its weight, their branches creaking like old wood, and the temperature dropped fast. At first we thought it was just a storm rolling in, but the sky was clear, not a cloud in sight. And the wind, it wasn't natural. It came in bursts, starting and stopping, almost like it was breathing. Jake was the first to notice something strange. "Do you hear that?" he asked, cocking his head to one side. We all fell silent, straining our ears. There was something just barely audible over the wind, a soft, rhythmic tapping, like someone knocking on wood. It seemed to be coming from deep in the woods, but it echoed in a way that made it hard to tell how far. We exchanged uneasy glances, but none of us wanted to admit we were spooked. "Probably just a branch knocking against a tree," Luke said, though he didn't sound convinced. The tapping continued, growing louder as the night wore on, and soon it was impossible to ignore. It wasn't just random knocks anymore. It was too rhythmic, too deliberate, like footsteps. Sarah shivered. "I don't like this," she said. "It's too quiet." She was right. Aside from the wind and the tapping, the forest was dead silent. No crickets, no rustling of animals in the underbrush. Nothing. It was as if everything in the forest had gone still, waiting. We tried to brush it off, sitting closer to the fire, but the unease crept in like a shadow. That's when Sarah noticed something in the trees. "Do you see that?" she whispered, pointing toward the tree line. We all turned, squinting into the darkness beyond the firelight. At first I didn't see anything, but then, just for a moment, I caught a glimpse of something moving between the trees. It was tall, too tall to be a person, and its movements were wrong, jerky, unnatural, like it didn't quite understand how to move through the forest. I tried to tell myself it was a trick of the light, the flickering flames playing with my eyes, but then I saw it again. And this time so did everyone else. "Who the hell is that?" Jake muttered, standing up, his eyes locked on the figure. We all stood tense as the figure moved closer to the edge of the clearing. It didn't come into the light, but it stayed just out of reach, pacing back and forth like it was watching us. Luke grabbed the flashlight from his pack and shone it toward the trees, but as soon as the beam hit the figure, it was gone. Vanished like it had never been there. The woods fell silent again. The wind stopped, and for a moment all we could hear was the crackling of the fire and our own ragged breathing. "We need to go," Sarah whispered, her voice shaking. We all agreed. We packed up quickly, stuffing our gear into our packs as fast as we could. But just as we were about to extinguish the fire, we heard it, the sound that still haunts me to this day. A voice, faint but clear. It came from the woods, from the exact spot where the figure had disappeared. And it was calling our names. Not just any names. Our names. One by one, in that same eerie, breathy tone, it whispered each of us over and over again. Sarah's face went pale, and Luke dropped his flashlight, his hands trembling. No one moved. We just stood there, paralyzed by the sound. Then the voice changed. It stopped calling our names and began to mimic us. It was repeating things we had said earlier around the campfire, in the exact tone and cadence. Little jokes, offhand comments, things only we would know. It was like it was trying to lure us into the woods, to draw us away from the fire. Suddenly Jake broke the silence. "We need to leave now." Without another word, we grabbed our gear and bolted for the car, stumbling through the dark woods, the voice still calling after us, still repeating our words. I don't know how we made it back to the car without getting lost, but by the time we reached it, the voice had faded into the distance. We didn't speak on the drive home. We just sat there in silence, too shaken to process what had happened. But as we pulled onto the main road, Sarah broke down, sobbing. "I don't think it's over," she said through her tears. I didn't understand what she meant until I got home. Later that night, as I lay in bed, trying to shake off the unease of the trip, I heard it again. My name. It was soft, barely a whisper, but unmistakable. It came from the corner of the room, from the shadows. I sat up, my heart racing, but there was nothing there. And then I heard it again. This time it was laughing. I never told the others. But I know, deep down, that whatever was in those woods that night, it followed us home. And every once in a while, in the dead of night, I still hear it, calling my name. I've always loved the wilderness. There's something about being completely alone in nature that calms me, helps me reset. So when I found this spot online, a secluded forest deep in the Pacific Northwest, it seemed perfect. No tourists, no cell phone signal, just me and the trees. I packed up my gear and set out for what I thought would be a peaceful weekend of camping. The trailhead was hard to find, almost like it didn't want to be discovered. My GPS kept glitching, but I chalked it up to the remoteness. After hours of hiking, I finally found the clearing I'd seen online. It was surrounded by towering pines, their branches so dense they blocked out the sunlight, casting long shadows across the forest floor. But the spot was perfect. Quiet, isolated, and far from any sign of civilization. As evening fell, I set up my tent, built a fire, and settled in. The first strange thing happened just after dusk. I was sitting by the fire, watching the flames dance, when I noticed the forest around me was too quiet. No crickets, no birds, not even the rustling of leaves in the wind. Just silence. It felt wrong, unnatural, but I brushed it off as city nerves. Maybe I just wasn't used to this level of quiet. But then came the footsteps, faint at first, like someone walking through the underbrush. I looked around, shining my flashlight into the darkness, but I couldn't see anything. Still, the feeling of being watched crept over me like a cold hand on the back of my neck. I told myself it was just my imagination and retreated to my tent, hoping that sleep would come quickly. It didn't. Around midnight, I heard the sound again, footsteps, but this time they were closer, circling my tent. My heart pounded in my chest. I grabbed the knife I always kept in my pack and slowly unzipped the tent, trying to be as quiet as possible. My flashlight flickered as I swept it through the trees, the beam weak and erratic. Nothing, just darkness and shadows. I could still feel it, though. That heavy, oppressive feeling of being watched. I forced myself to breathe, to calm down, and after what felt like an eternity, I crawled back into the tent. Sleep was impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard whispers, faint, unintelligible, like they were carried on the wind. But there was no wind. The air was still, suffocating. I couldn't tell if the voices were outside or in my head. By the time dawn came, I was exhausted. My nerves were shot and I was ready to pack up and leave. But something stopped me. Maybe pride, maybe stupidity. I told myself I was overreacting. It was just one weird night. So I stayed, and that was my mistake. The second night, everything escalated. It started with the fire. I had gathered wood earlier and set it ablaze just after sunset. But as I sat by it, trying to convince myself that the daylight had burned away the fear, the flames suddenly died, snuffed out like someone had thrown water on them. I scrambled to relight it, but the matches wouldn't catch. It was as if the air itself refused to ignite. Then the noises returned, this time louder. Footsteps, yes, but also something else. Breathing. Ragged, heavy breathing. It was all around me, surrounding the camp. My flashlight, now fully dead, was useless. I could feel the presence, whatever it was, getting closer. I ran for my tent, but before I could reach it, I saw something move in the trees. At first, it was just a shadow slipping between the trunks, but then I saw it. Pale, gaunt, and inhumanly tall. Its eyes glowed faintly in the darkness, not with light, but with something darker, something wrong. It didn't move like a person, more like... It glided, its limbs too long, its face twisted in a permanent silent scream. I froze. My body refused to move. The thing stared at me from the edge of the clearing, and then, slowly, it pointed. Not at me, but at something behind me. I turned, and that's when I saw them, figures, dozens of them standing just beyond the ring of trees. They were transparent, like wisps of smoke, but they were there, silent, watching. I could feel their eyes on me, cold and hungry. Panicking, I grabbed my backpack and ran. I didn't care where, I just needed to get away. Branches tore at my skin, and my lungs burned as I ran through the trees, but no matter how far I went, I could still hear the footsteps behind me, matching my pace. Eventually I collapsed, exhausted, and waited for whatever it was to find me. But the footsteps stopped. The silence returned. Slowly, I lifted my head, half expecting to see the pale figure looming over me, but there was nothing. I was alone. Shaking, I got back on my feet and somehow managed to stumble back to my campsite. My tent was gone. Everything, my gear, my supplies, vanished without a trace. In their place was something else, an old, rotting campsite, the remains of a tent torn and weathered with age. But this campsite, it looked familiar. And then it hit me. It was mine. My backpack, my supplies, everything. It was there, but aged, decayed, like it had been left there for years. I heard the whisper again, closer this time. You never left. I ran, my heart pounding in my ears. I don't remember how I made it out of that forest, but when I reached the trailhead, something was waiting for me. An old, rusted sign I hadn't noticed before, half buried in the dirt. It read, "Trail closed, missing persons, 1974. And, beneath it, almost too faded to read, "Do not enter after dark." As I stood there trembling, I felt a cold breath on the back of my neck. A voice, faint and distant, whispered, "Welcome back." And that's when I realized I'd never left. I was one of them now, trapped in that endless ghostly cycle. No one ever leaves. I don't know why I thought camping alone would be a good idea. Maybe it was the allure of silence, the promise of disconnecting from the noise of the city, or just the challenge of pushing my limits. I've always been an outdoorsman, but never this deep in the woods, never this isolated. I found the campsite tucked away near a small clearing, surrounded by towering pines and dense underbrush. It was miles from any trailhead. No cell service, no people for at least a day's hike in any direction. Perfect for the solitude I thought I needed. The first day was uneventful. I set up my tent, gathered some wood, and settled in. The stillness was unnerving at first, but eventually it became almost meditative. By nightfall, I sat by the fire, watching the flames dance, trying to shake the strange sensation that I was being watched. I told myself it was just the isolation messing with my head. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something felt off. As the fire dwindled, I started hearing it, soft at first, almost like the wind rustling the trees, but different. It was a distant whisper, a murmur, just beyond the tree line. I paused, straining to listen, but it stopped as soon as I focused on it. Brushing it off, I crawled into my tent and zipped it shut, convincing myself it was nothing but the woods playing tricks on my mind. That night, sleep didn't come easy. Every time I began to drift off, I'd hear the whisper again, closer, louder, more distinct. It wasn't just the wind, it was a voice, and it was calling my name. I shot up in my sleeping bag, heart racing, ears straining for any sound beyond the tent's thin walls. Silence. Complete and utter silence. But now I was wide awake, adrenaline coursing through me. I grabbed my flashlight, unzipped the tent, and stepped outside. The night was still. Too still. Not a single cricket chirped, no wind in the trees. The forest around me felt suffocating, like it was waiting for something. The beam of my flashlight cut through the darkness, but it did little to ease the oppressive feeling hanging over the campsite. I scanned the tree line, expecting to see what? An animal? A person? But there was nothing. Just the endless stretch of woods. I decided to stoke the fire, adding more wood until the flames roared again. It brought some comfort, at least enough to convince me I was safe for the moment. But then I saw them. At first I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me, but no. There, just beyond the light of the fire, stood a figure. Pale, almost translucent. It was a woman, her face hidden in shadow, but I could see her outline, see her long, tattered dress blowing gently as if caught in a breeze that didn't exist. I froze, every muscle in my body locking up. The whispering returned, louder now, insistent, circling me. I couldn't understand the words, but I knew they were meant for me. I blinked, and she was gone. I stumbled back into the tent, zipped it up, and grabbed the knife I'd brought. I held it in front of me, hand trembling. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. It had to be some kind of trick, a hallucination from exhaustion or fear. The night dragged on, every minute feeling like an hour. The whispers continued, growing louder, sometimes right next to my ear, other times fading into the distance. But they never stopped. Eventually, I must have passed out from sheer exhaustion because when I opened my eyes again, it was morning. The sunlight streaming through the tent brought a small measure of relief, but the dread hadn't left. I packed up my gear as quickly as I could, eager to get out of those woods, to get back to civilization. As I hiked, though, something felt wrong. I couldn't quite place it, but the forest seemed different. The trees, they didn't look like they did the day before. The path I had taken in didn't seem familiar anymore. I was starting to panic, my breathing becoming shallow. Then I saw it, a clearing up ahead. Relief flooded through me as I picked up the pace. But when I broke through the trees, my heart dropped into my stomach. It was the same campsite, my campsite, the same fire pit, the same tent stakes still lodged in the ground. I had been walking in circles. Impossible. I knew I had been going in a straight line, following the map. I hadn't turned around. I hadn't made a mistake. That's when I heard it again. The whisper, clear as day now, coming from directly behind me. I spun around, and there she was, the same pale figure, standing no more than 10 feet away. But now I could see her face. Hollow eyes stared at me, her mouth moving slowly, forming words I couldn't hear but somehow understood. "You shouldn't have come here." I stumbled backward, my pulse pounding in my ears. I tried to run, but my legs wouldn't move. It felt like the ground beneath me was pulling me down, like invisible hands were gripping my ankles. Suddenly I was falling, the earth giving way beneath me, plunging me into darkness. I woke up in my tent, heart hammering in my chest, the sunlight once again streaming in. For a moment, I thought it was all a dream, but my body ached, dirt clung to my clothes, and the whispers were still there, faint, lingering at the edge of my hearing. I packed up and left, following the same path out of the woods. But when I finally emerged, I saw the sign. A faded, weathered wooden sign covered in moss, barely readable. Campsite closed, 1978, fatal accident, 2 campers missing, presumed dead. My blood ran cold. As I stood there, frozen, I glanced back at the forest. The shadows between the trees seemed darker, thicker, and for a brief moment, I saw her again, just at the edge of the woods, watching me. I turned and ran, but now even back home, far from those woods, I still hear the whispering. Every night it grows louder. Every night it's closer, and I don't think I'll ever escape it.